Thank you, friends, for joining us today. I'm extremely excited. I just met a young gentleman who is going to just blow it out of the water here. His name is Joey Pontarelli. And as you know, this is the With All Your Heart podcast, where we speak about the Catholic faith. We speak about fatherhood, men, masculinity, and all the great things that marriage and family brings to this world. And in the house today on our podcast is Joey Pontarelli, who is someone who's an expert in the world of can I say divorce and the ramifications of that, Joey, and the healing behind it. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, yeah. As far
Yeah,
as it concerns, young
yeah,
people who come from
yeah,
these broken families,
yeah.
absolutely.
So Joey, thank you for being on the podcast today.
No, I'm honored to be here, and I don't know if I would call myself an expert, but I certainly have a lot of experience here. So
Yeah.
I'm honored to be with you, and love the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. So you know a little bit about me. We're kind of in the same world where we're interested in the healing of hearts,
Yeah.
uh, broken hearts and traumatized hearts. I wrote the book on the father wound,
Mhm.
and I call it The Father Wound and Beyond: Confronting and Healing the Greatest Wound of All. So that book is meant to help people who've had struggles with their father relationship and what
Yeah.
can be done about the healing. And Joey,
Beautiful.
you are in a similar realm. And if you could just explain what you do in your world.
Yeah, absolutely. So Restored, my apostolate,
Mm-hmm.
is an apostolate for teenagers and young adults who come from divorced or broken families. And we mainly just help them to heal and build virtue so they can break that cycle in their own lives and really build beautiful lives, build thriving
Yeah,
lives. And so
yeah.
the main way we do that is by producing content and some resources that make healing really simple, make virtue building really simple.
Mm-hmm.
And it really goes back to my story, which I can get into if you'd like. But
Yeah,
that's kind of the quick version about Restored.
yeah, awesome. So in your restore, I think it's restoredministry.com, correct?
You
If
got it.
anybody wants
Yep.
to see that. And I understand you have a book out called It's Not Your Fault,
Yep.
a practical guide to navigating the pain and problems from your parents' divorce. Wow, that sounds extremely interesting. Tell me a little bit about your book and how that came about.
Yeah, yeah. It really came out of a need for to hand young people, especially, a packaged resource that they could flip through and just learn more about, other people who've been through what they've been through. So
Mm-hmm.
the US Census says that every year there's over 1 million American children who go through their parents' divorce. They define child as anyone 17 and younger.
Mm-hmm.
That means there's tens of millions of people who come from broken families, who come from divorced families, and for so many of them, they don't get the help that they deserve.
Yep.
And as a result, they carry this untreated trauma around with them. They often, are living lives of vice, of sin.
Yep.
And as a result of that, they build these unhealthy relationships, weak marriages, and broken families. And the cycle just repeats itself for often generations.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
so we want to break that cycle. That's our entire vision. And so one tool we've introduced is just this book. So it's a 33 question and answer format book where we just touch on the most pressing challenges that teenagers and young adults who come from divorce or even just broken families, whether the parents are separated or there's just a lot of dysfunction at home. So we 33 questions and answers on these like super pressing challenges, such as, navigating emotional problems like anxiety, depression, loneliness. We give them some advice from experts. We point them to resources that could help them. For the Catholic young people, we talk to them about annulments. Like one
Mm-hmm.
question that will come up often is like, if, my parents get an annulment, is that going to make me like this illegitimate child? There's a lot of
Right.
confusion around that. So
Mm-hmm.
we kind of get into that. We talk about challenges in your relationship with your parents. One of the most common things that we see is that when, your parents get divorced, there's just a lot of struggles in your relationship with your parents for many reasons. And so we
Yeah.
offer some advice for how to navigate those, how to heal, things like that. So the book is it's a short format. Each chapter or each question, I should say, takes probably, no longer than a couple pages to read, minutes we're talking about. And that's the book. So by reading it, young people will just have a better idea of like, okay, now I understand more about this whole trauma, what the research has to say about coming from a broken family.
Mm-hmm.
I have some tips and things that I could use that are very practical. Like that's one thing we pride ourselves on is like, for example, when I give talks, I always want them to be the most practical talks that someone will ever hear.
Yep.
And so that's what the book is like too. But yeah, people will learn how to, navigate their relationship with their parents better, how to even build healthier relationships themselves, according to experts and beautiful couples that have done it, and so much more. So that's a bit about the book, but that's just
Yeah.
one of our resources.
Yeah, that's great. That sounds like a fantastic book.
Thank you.
Um, we have a mutual friend, Dr. Bob Schutz.
He's a man.
Yeah. And so I first heard of your name on his show just probably a month or two ago when you
Sure.
did the podcast with him and Jake Kim on Restore the Glory, I believe is the name of their podcast.
Yeah.
And I said, wow, I gotta get this Joey guy on my show here. So you really spelled out a lot of what you do. And I really want people to understand that being a child from a divorce, there is hope. And Joey, before we dive into your story, I'll just give you a little background of my childhood, which
Please.
kind of will make pieces of the puzzle actually go together even better here as we speak about this topic here.
Beautiful.
So
Okay.
my mother and father, we were raised Catholic. I was the oldest of 9 kids, 3 brothers, 5 sisters. We went to church every Sunday. However, because of alcohol in our family, as far as mom and dad were concerned, they drank a lot. And so there was tension and anger and shouting and screaming and yelling all the time between mom and dad, especially, of course. And so that was always a sorrow in our lives as children to have to deal with this, because a mom and dad are supposed to be loving and then show that love to the children. And that was kind of really missing in our lives. And so we terribly struggled throughout that. And like you say, my siblings to this very day as adults, I can see the traumatic effects in their lives right now with their broken relationships and their struggles in life. So I think we are on a similar have a similar history. However, one thing that somehow happened in my life was my parents never divorced. They are still together. Dad is 81. Mom, I think, is about 77.
Okay.
And they're still together. Thank goodness that God provided that for them, that grace that they needed to stick it out. So Joey, let's hear your story too. Please share it with the audience.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing yours. And I can relate in so many levels.
Mm-hmm.
I was about 11 years old when my parents separated, and they later got divorced. And I remember the day that my mom broke the news to us. I didn't really know what to do with that news, that my dad was no longer living with us and they were pursuing a divorce. And so I remember just hiding in the closet and crying and sitting in the closet. I couldn't have put it into words then, but I felt abandoned. I felt unwanted. I felt like I just wasn't good enough. And in the months and years that followed, I dealt with all sorts of pain and problems. I dealt with emotional problems like anxiety, depression, loneliness, a lot of anger for me as a kid. I dealt with relationship struggles. I remember swearing to myself, like, I will never get married, because if this is where marriage leads, why in the world would I want that? Over the years, just struggled with unhealthy relationships and just not really knowing how to trust, how to be vulnerable, how to deal with conflict, because that was never really modeled for me. And then once I got, towards the dating world, I just felt really lost. I felt honestly incompetent. Like I didn't really know what I was doing. And when it came to building like a healthy relationship and even a marriage.
Sure, because you
And
had
so,
never seen a healthy relationship, I guess, in your childhood.
yeah, exactly. John Paul II, called the family the school of love. And we're really meant to learn how to love, how to build a relationship, how to even build a marriage in our families. And for those of us who, saw a broken model of love and marriage, like again, like we kind of end up becoming somewhat incompetent. We can relearn that. Like, I love the fact that you said there's so much hope, and there is. And I know normally where we start with this is the kind of the depth of the problem, which is the right place to start, but there is so much hope, and we'll get to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I couldn't agree more that if it's not modeled for you, what actually happens, I don't understand all the neurobiology to this, but it's actually like programmed into you to just repeat the patterns that you saw growing up. So for example, my parents, when there was conflict, similar to yours, there would, things would get kind of loud, they would argue, and then they both would go their separate ways, maybe slamming a door, dad might leave the house for a while. And, we never saw conflict resolved. And so, even in my friendships, I remember growing up, I would just feel, like, oh, I would try to avoid conflict at all costs. And if there was conflict, it would be, really difficult to navigate and uncomfortable. But then over the years, thankfully I was able to learn, oddly in the business world, how to better handle conflict. And that helped in my relationships and better able to handle it now. I'm not perfect at it. I still make mistakes 100%, but certainly in a much better spot than I was before. So I think we can like do the reprogramming and learn how to love, but we truly need like an apprenticeship in love.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we're trying to provide for the young people that we serve, is that for so many of them, all they saw of love and marriage was just this really broken model. And so they think one, it might not even be possible to build a healthy, joyful marriage.
Mhm.
And two, even if it is for other people, it's probably not possible for them. And so what we want to tell them is like, no, no, you certainly can. Like you
Yeah.
can learn how to love. Like God's grace by far is the biggest hack that you could use to build any sort of virtue and learn how to love.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of human things you could do too. Like one of the programs we're building now, we're just piloting it, is called the School of Love. We're calling it the
Uh,
School of Love, where we take, young adults from broken families, so like 18 and up, and then we pair them up with a healthy marriage and family so that they
oh,
can just
wow.
spend
What
like
a great idea.
they can spend like two. It's simple, really. Honestly, it's like spend 2 evenings a month, like having a meal and maybe
Wow.
just hanging out around a bonfire, or,
Mhm.
playing games or doing something that's just like showing these young people who come from really broken families, hey, this is what a functional, healthy family looks
Yeah.
like,
Wow.
so that they get hope that, wow, it is possible. And two, they can learn like these are some practical things you can do to do it. And that was my story, honestly, to kind of go back to that.
Yeah.
Um, I just felt really broken, and knew I needed healing and looked around for some help and didn't really find any help when it came to my own like trauma.
Yeah.
And over the years, I just recognized how my siblings were struggling from the breakdown of my family, how close friends of mine who were going through their parents' divorce were struggling, a lot of times in serious ways. And then I started just reading the research and just understanding like this is a huge problem. And for some reason, no one's really doing anything about it. And
Yeah.
so after, studying finance, getting my MBA, a lot of experience in the business world, scaling a company, I just wanted to take those skills, and I felt God was calling me to do something about this problem. And so that's where I started Restore. But to go to the kind of the marriage question, there were two marriages, Joe and Maria, and then Mike and Ann, who they just had beautiful families, really joyful marriages, not void of any problems, but certainly like doing really, really well.
Mhm.
And I just loved being at their home. I loved just observing them as a couple. And I just, again, kind of soaked in their model, their example. And I've been able to replicate some of that, certainly still working on it. But yeah, it's I think that's really beautiful. But that's Restored in a nutshell, kind of how
Yeah.
the origin story started. And there's
Mhm.
certainly more I can go into if you'd like, but that kind of led me to this point of starting this apostolate,
Yeah.
like we mentioned, to help teenagers and young adults who come from broken families.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that, Joey. I
So,
just read this morning. I don't know if you get the loop, the Catholic vote, the loop. It's an email that comes up
okay,
every morning with
nice.
the latest of news about Catholic stuff. They
Mm,
just put out this morning statistics saying that back in 2008, men would on average get married around the age of 29 and women around the age of 25.
interesting.
Now in
Okay.
2022, closer to our time, the men now get married at an average age of 34, not 29. Now it's up to 34. And women have moved from 25 now to 29 is when they get married. And it just makes me wonder,
Hmm.
does that also have something to do with fewer people getting married? So there's a smaller group of people to poll, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because people say, if this is what marriage is, I don't want to have anything to do with it. What do you think?
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a lot there to uncover, but I would say the thing that's often missing in the conversation, what how it's often caricatured, is that young people are just like afraid of commitment. They're very shallow. They just want pleasure. They want to hook up. They want to,
Yeah.
just be void of commitment. And I think there is some of that. But I think underneath all of that is this deep fear that they would end up, repeating that
Mhm.
cycle that they saw in the marriages around them
Yeah.
for so many young people.
Mhm.
And, so I think the fear drives them away from any sort of commitment, any sort of love, because they might think, well, my dad just up and left with some other woman.
Mhm.
How do I know that this guy, a young woman might say this, how do I know this guy that I'm going to pick, might not in like 5 or 7 years just say, you know what, I'm done with it. I'd rather just avoid that altogether, like you
Yeah.
said so well.
Mhm.
So I think that's at the core of a lot of it. And yeah, I think there is like overall this just big skepticism towards love and marriage, and the thought that even love can maybe even be more authentic without that sort of commitment is something that I see a lot, which is interesting. And so, I think we certainly need to kind of reintroduce this idea that marriage is a really beautiful thing.
Hmm.
And it's really the best case scenario, not just for the spouses. Like spouses end up being like healthier and happier, if they're in a good marriage. But it's also best for the children. And
Yeah.
it's the best institution that we know of to date, looking at all of history and all of anthropology, saying that this is the best environment for a young person to grow up into, with mom and dad, their biological parents.
Yep.
And they have three things. They have the love of the father, they have the love of the mother, and they have stability.
Yes.
And so what often happens, and I know we'll probably get to this too, in our culture is when, stability is shaken a bit, like your story,
Yep.
the kind of knee-jerk reactions say, well, let's just get divorced.
Hmm.
That's everyone will be happier, things will be better, the kids are resilient, they'll be fine. And, we offer that as this like great solution. Um, the data is really clear. It's not a great solution, even for the
Right.
parents. Even though the parents might be, stepping away from some situation that is difficult, there's other problems that later present themselves that you can't even see at that moment.
Hmm.
But then for the children, we can get into the research if you want, but it's super clear that in these situations, the kids end up suffering a ton and suffering more than they would often, even if things at home are a little bit dicey. Now, I want to be careful here. I know people are listening thinking, well, what about cases of abuse? So that's kind of a separate conversation.
Right.
In
Right.
those cases, what the church teaches and what we would say, I know you would say this too, Bob,
Hmm.
is get to safety, get
Sure.
to
Right.
safety. And
Yeah.
so if that sometimes the path of healing a marriage and a family involves a separation.
Yeah.
I know families right now that are going through this.
Hmm.
But as canon law says, I think it's like 1153, and canon 1153, it talks about it, how the goal, even if that separation is necessary, is to heal the marriage and bring the family back together.
Sure.
And we never hear that in our world, even in the
Right.
church, sadly.
Right.
And so I think we need to get back to that and just say that this is like marriage is a beautiful thing. It can be beautiful, and we just need to help people build beautiful marriages and help children to really, thrive in that environment so that they can go on and build those healthy relationships,
Yeah.
strong marriages and holy families, and then that cycle can repeat itself, not the cycle of dysfunction and divorce that we see all around us.
Right. Yeah. Joey, so many things going through my mind as you're speaking here. One thing that went through my mind is that the word covenant, which is what a
Mhm.
marriage is. A covenant is not a contract. A contract is what you do in your business, with your MBA and then your business world there. It's
Yeah.
it's an agreement between two people. A covenant is a giving of yourself to the other person. And like it's got some permanency to it.
Mm.
And there was a time when my wife and I were arguing. This was several years ago, and I remember one of the boys said, "Mom and Dad, are you going to get a divorce?" And
Uh,
the funny thing is that they were very very young when they said that, so they just didn't know what they were saying.
yeah, yeah,
But that is just something my wife and I, who we were both raised Catholic. She's a very strong Catholic, beautiful woman, and that just does not enter our mind. Never has entered our mind. Will never enter our mind because we know this is a covenant. This is
mm,
an agreement between the two of us and God as well. And
yeah,
we made this promise to ourselves. We signed this covenant with our hearts, with God right there with us on that day we were married.
mm,
And there are, I think, people who look at marriage sometimes thinking, there is a way out, because that's what our world and our culture tells us. If it gets
yeah,
too bad, there is a way out. You can back out if you want to. And
yeah,
it's unfortunate that that's sometimes the mentality, the mindset that we've been fed. Just take the easy way out. We know,
yeah,
Joey, we know that in marriages, there's ups and downs. It's a roller coaster ride. Some days are bad, some days are great. And that's why we are told, for better or for worse, we just
yeah.
stick it through, right?
Amen. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with everything you just said. And I've been married about 6 years now. And
Mm-hmm.
even in that short time, we've had seasons of really, challenges, difficult things to go through. I remember early on in marriage, we really struggled with a couple things. One was handling conflict, not
Mm-hmm.
surprising given my background. I just like didn't really know how to go about it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it would end up just getting nowhere. And we needed some help. So we got some counseling and, learned some tactics on how to, handle that. But Yeah, it was really, a challenging, difficult thing to go through, but it was never even crossed my mind, like you said, to call it quits. It's not
Mhm.
even in my vocabulary. I agree
Yeah.
with you,
Hmm.
to do that. And so I think that's a really important thing to start out in a marriage. Like, look for someone, if there's any single people listening right now, look for someone who just believes that in the permanence of marriage. And like you said, there's just such a deeper bond than just that legal bond.
Yeah.
And people can talk about it in different ways. I know if some more secular people might not fully understand like the whole spiritual depth to it, but there's something about it, even on a human level, that it's like, no, you're promising your love for life because love song is eternity. Like when you love someone, you want to give them everything. You want to love them forever.
Yeah.
Anything less than that is not really authentic love.
Hmm.
And so it's the permanence that love like requires. I think is there's no better place than the sacrament, of marriage. And so yeah, I agree. It's important to distinguish between the contract and the covenant because what happens often is like if there's this extreme case of like abuse or something like that, which accounts for about 30% of divorces. The best data I've seen on this
Hmm.
is about 30% of divorces are like those high conflict situations where there might be abuse, violence, the threat of death, things like that.
Hmm.
And in those situations, like, of course, you might need to go a legal route to protect, the spouse and the children. But again, that the marriage, deeper marriage bond is not affected by that,
Hmm.
legal severing. And again, I've heard stories, beautiful stories of couples who there was a lot of many problems. They ended up getting divorced and then they ended up finding their way back to each other and
Yeah.
building really beautiful marriages, which is super, super hopeful as well. So yeah, a couple different things there, but I agree that we need to like proclaim the permanence of marriage. And I think that, um, the young people that I see, like they want that. I
Hmm.
think they're often too afraid to even believe in it
Yeah.
because of what they saw around them.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
couldn't agree more with you.
Yeah. So Joey, I've coached several little league baseball teams and I've
Nice.
coached football, with the younger children. And,
Love it.
after just a couple practices, I can almost point out to you the children who come from broken families and specifically divorced families, because
Hmm.
these are children they get frustrated way more easily. They get more angrily or get more angry more easily than the other players. And there's just something about them. There's an isolation that you can just kind of sense.
Yeah.
And so often my senses tell me that that's the case, and I find out that later on, yes, it is. So you have,
Wow.
these young children who at such a young age it's already affecting them so deeply, just like your 11-year-old self, that little boy there, Joey, in the closet crying. My heart just breaks for you to hear this story.
Yeah.
And 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 how this pain just perpetuates and affects children so deeply. So God bless you for what you're doing, Joey.
Hmm. Thank you so much. And no, my heart breaks for him too, like that younger version of me. And
Hmm.
that really, I know, just like you, we share this heart for having families just like thrive and live like holy lives. And even amidst struggles and pain and suffering, like you can live like a really joyful, happy life and meaningful life, more importantly. And so, yeah, it's sad, so sad to me that there's like, as we're speaking right now, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these young people just in America who, they're sitting in that closet, they're crying, they're, broken by what they see at home. They're struggling with emotional problems, they're struggling in their relationships, they're struggling with even extreme things that we see, like kids who are cutting, who are
Hmm.
tempted to suicide. Because if you come from a divorced family, you're more likely to attempt suicide.
Sure.
There's so many statistics. If you want to get into, we can. But
Hmm.
basically, yeah, it just causes all these problems, and there's such a huge, huge need. And that I think the most tragic thing that I've seen is that we end up again repeating the cycle in our own lives. Like we want better. We
Yeah.
know, like, I don't want that broken family that I had.
Hmm.
But then we so often, unless there's grace, unless there's like an intentional effort to heal the trauma and to build virtue,
Hmm.
then we will often just go on and repeat that cycle. And then the worst of all, like we end up really harming the people that we love the most.
Yeah.
And how tragic is that? Nobody wants that, but we often just end up there, because of the things that we've been through. They, shape us in ways, they form us in ways that we often can't even put into words. and then we end up, going down this path that we never really wanted. So there is so much hope, though. We can, rewrite that. We can heal the trauma. We can build virtue. We can rely on God's grace. We can, go on and build a better, more beautiful life. I firmly believe in that.
Yeah. So I want to tell you a little story. This was a couple of years ago. My boys were playing with some neighbor boys, and the neighbor boys had a friend over. So there was the three boys playing with my two boys, football or something. And I just went out there just to say hello and introduce myself to, the new boy. And I got to talking to him, and I, for some reason, I must have asked him about his parents, and he said something about that. My parents are getting divorced, and this boy's 7 years old, and I didn't know what really to say, but I just told him, as my sadness overcame me and knowing what he's going through with his parents' divorce, I said, well, you know what? Jesus really loves you no matter what.
Wow.
And this little 7-year-old boy responds to me, and he says to me, Jesus is just a fable. He's just a story. He's not real. And he's using air quotes when he's telling me this.
Wow.
So I'm thinking, this little boy, this didn't come to him on his own. Someone must have told him that Jesus is not real.
Yeah.
And you can imagine how a divorce, when you have a father who represents God the Father in many ways, you have a mother who represents the church in so many ways, and the loss of love because of a divorce, the love that Jesus could provide this little guy is not going to be available because he's rejected Jesus, because he sees that rejection of love right there in his primary caregivers, his mom and dad. And I don't know if you want to speak on that, but if you do, great. And I do want to talk to you about those statistics that you also mentioned, Joey, too. But
Sure.
but yeah, just a story I wanted to share with you, and the
Yeah.
reality of the pain involved in how it affects our spiritual life.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's such a tragic story and so sad. And yeah, you wonder kind of what led up to that point for that young person. But I think it's really symbolic of what's happening as a culture to us. Young people are not practicing any sort of faith
Yeah.
in bigger and bigger droves. And there was, I think it was it was a Gallup study, and also another apostle that I can't think of the name of right now. JP DeGance is the um, guy who runs it, but if it comes to me, I'll mention it. But they looked at a bunch of this data, and they found that, yeah, the number one reason that people are rejecting God and leaving faith is because they come from broken families. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but
Sure.
that's profound. Like, why is this not being talked about more? And so it makes sense to me that a young person, like you said, who saw a lot of, broken commitment, a lot of a neglect and a distortion of love, would end up, saying, well, if this is the world that God creates, like, I want nothing to do with that God, and maybe he's not even real to begin with. And so certainly I've struggled with this in my own life, where, just that whole image of God the Father, like you said, our parents represent God to us because as kids, they're the most powerful creatures that we know.
Yeah.
So we tend to think, if they're like this, then God must be like this too. And a lot of this, again, is happening subconsciously. We don't put it into words.
Right.
And so yeah, when we then grow and, try to grow a relationship with God the Father, it can be really, really difficult because we have these preconceived notions about him. And so for me, I know, I've always been better able to just connect with Jesus, and God the Father has always kind of seemed like a little bit unsafe, or not someone I can like fully trust. Now I've grown there a bit, but it certainly that's kind of been my experience of coming from a broken family. But I think that the challenge for me and for everyone has always been to, it's like when you hear a rumor about someone else, like, oh, they're this way or they're that way. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe they are, but maybe they're not. We really owe it to ourselves, I think, to get to know the person as they are, instead of just trusting what we've maybe heard other people say about them. And so that's where, I think, like, through scripture, through the lives of the saints and through the sacraments, we can really understand, like, who truly is like God the Father, not just someone who I've heard about, but someone I get to know on a personal level. That's been, helpful and healing for me too. But when it comes to the statistics, yeah, it's pretty depressing. One of the studies, the most authoritative studies on this topic was done at the University of California at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, not exactly a conservative stronghold. They studied this problem for 25 years. Dr. Judith Wallerstein was the leading researcher at the time, and she followed 131 children from 60 families.
Hmm.
And she only picked children who didn't have any developmental or emotional problems prior to the divorce. And then she observed the impact that the divorce had on them. And then she would compare them to their peers who came from these intact families. And, after going into the research, I should say this first, she kind of expected to find what our culture says, and that is the divorce wouldn't really impact them much at all. And if it did, in kind of the rare case where it did impact them, it would be pretty temporary, short-lived. It wouldn't last very long. But after studying it for a while, she said something like, our findings challenge the myth that divorce is this transient crisis, and then as soon as the parents reestablish their lives, the children will recover fully. She said that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And in her research, kind of paired with some national data too, she found that children of divorce were, less likely to get married, more likely to get divorced, less likely to have children, more likely to struggle with things like, emotional problems like anxiety, depression, even struggle with like alcohol and drugs in high school, more likely to attempt suicide, like I mentioned before, and just a whole host of problems like, behavioral problems, social, kind of stunting social growth. But most of all, what they found was there were two areas or two main takeaways. The first one was that the full effect from your parents' divorce actually isn't experienced until adulthood. She called it the sleeper effect. It kind of stays dormant a bit. It doesn't mean you're not affected before, but once you get like college age and beyond, the effects surface much more strongly.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah, no, me too. And
yeah, not till my later 30s and 40s did I start discovering all of this stuff here.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's common. And so the second thing I was just going to say, the kind of biggest area, even though all those problems I mentioned are serious enough, the biggest area is just that of your life that's impacted by your parents' divorce is your own relationships, especially your future marriage. And we've already talked a bit about that because we've seen such a broken model of love and marriage. Right. We don't know how to go about it ourselves. Yeah. And so that's just some of the research. There's lots of other sources. And if people want to look into the data a little bit more, that book is called The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce. It just details that 25-year-long study. Dr. Paul Amato, he's a sociologist at Penn State right now, actually. And he has done probably more research on this than anyone else. He does like meta-analyses where he's looking at studies that have already been done and kind of summarizing them. So there's a lot of data out there, and it's really unequivocal that divorce damages children. Yeah. And even in those situations where it's necessary because of, abuse or violence, those 30% of cases that I mentioned, it's still not this like cakewalk. It's not this great thing, this magic pill that fixes everything. It's just what I've seen. It's just, it is a bit of a reprieve, but it's kind of one trauma on top of another. Yeah. And we would never call that like a great thing. And so certainly more data to discuss, but that's kind of a snapshot.
Yeah. So folks, I'm talking to Joey Pontarelli. He is with restoredministry.com. And his book, It's Not Your Fault, A Practical Guide to Navigating the Pain and Problems from Your Parents' Divorce. And get that book. This is a fantastic book. I can assure you, I want to get this book. Joey, you're going to be helping so many people. I'm sure you've helped a ton of people already in this world. So thank you, and God bless you for what you're doing. Earlier in this interview, you had mentioned something about 1 million children every year suffer the consequences of their parents' divorce. And funny thing is, I totally agree with that statement because I researched that and I put that in my book as well, my book on the father wound. And I have a short section on the divorce wound in my book. And so because I know how painful it is, and you and I, again, like we're in that healing apostolate ministry things that we do, we're looking for ways to heal people's hearts. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And is that truly the case? 1 million new children every year are affected by their parents' divorce.
Yeah, no, it's shocking to hear that. But according to the U.S. Census, that's what they found. Again, they define a child in that as anyone 17 and younger. So it doesn't talk about children who are over that age, maybe in college, which often divorces can happen then. Yeah. The other thing too is they're not including separations, so that's a totally separate, data set, which is huge as well. Right. And then also they're not including situations where the parents were never married to begin with. which
Wow.
is becoming more and
Sure.
more common today. You know, not
Hmm.
maybe not as much in the Catholic world, but certainly in the world at large. Like there's, yeah, mom and dad essentially are living together. They've
Hmm.
grown a family, except that they never were married. And
Yeah.
so when that breaks apart, even though it's not captured in that data, the young people experience the same effects. So even if we looked at the 90s alone,
Mm.
that's, 10 million people or
Wow.
more than 10 million
Yeah.
people. That's bigger than the size of, New York City. That's, twice the size. I think twice the size of like Sweden. And it's just
Mm.
insane. It's like, it's hard to
Yeah.
even put your head around the fact that there's just so many people. And so I think when people hear all this, they go often in the direction, well, if this was that big of a problem, wouldn't be we be hearing more about it?
Hmm.
And or maybe it's not that big of a deal. Maybe everyone is for the best. And I would say that what's happened is we often look at the symptoms of the problem. We see
Hmm.
people struggling with alcohol. We see them struggling with anxiety, depression. We see people committing suicide. All these
Yeah.
problems in our culture that we're very viscerally aware of,
Hmm.
and we think that, well, that's just a problem in and of itself. We don't really know the root of it. But when you start drilling down to the root, as I'm sure you've
Yeah.
seen so much in your work, it's like, no, no,
Hmm.
no, there's deep wounds, there's trauma there. And so often the trauma is family trauma, some sort of family trauma, some sort of childhood trauma. And it's, we need to go there. We need to heal that in order to move on in life. And that's the best way to actually heal the symptoms too,
Yeah.
is by going to the root
Yeah.
and healing that there. So yeah, that number is shocking, but it is true.
Yeah. So Joey, I've experienced this with close family members where the marriage broke apart.
Mm,
And one thing I recall when this was happening to one of my siblings was that um, there's this deep, the pain is so deep between the husband and the wife because of the separation, this breakage,
mm.
that there's this inward looking at their own selves, and the children kind of get put to the wayside. Is that kind of what you've seen and experienced and researched, this type of phenomenon?
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Mm.
One of my friends he's actually becoming a priest, he said that just like during a divorce, after a divorce, the kids are often forgotten.
Mm.
And it sounds kind of extreme, and people will be like, no, parents love their kids. And it's true, they do love their kids. And I think most parents would do anything for their kids. They take a bullet for them.
Yeah.
But again, so often this problem of the family breaking apart, divorce, it's not truly represented. If parents knew, I'm convinced the impact it would have on their children, they would never even go there, except in those extreme situations where there needed to be some sort of separation for safety.
Right.
And so, yeah, no, we've certainly have seen that play out in my ministry
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. You mentioned that your wife and you had gone through some counseling. Is that correct? At some
That's right.
point? Yeah. And
Yeah.
I am commending you for mentioning that, because a lot of people don't want to admit that
Mm.
they need counseling, they need help.
Yeah.
We're tough guys. We're supposed to handle things on our own, right, Joey? And
Yeah.
yet counseling is part of God's plan, in my opinion, because he uses other people to help other people. For crying out loud, that's what you're doing, Joey, right now with your ministry. You are helping other people who have been in this pain. But
Mm.
with
Likewise.
counseling, for example, back in 2010, my story goes back to a meeting and a men's retreat with a Catholic marriage and family counselor who
Beautiful.
totally flipped my world upside down, taught me how to forgive. Uh, and I received the most incredible healing with that person at that moment. Grace was flowing, of course, too, but I needed another person involved to help me get through my traumas, the abuse, the neglect, everything. They helped me through it. And so,
Mm.
if you could just talk on how important counseling has been for you, and the encouragement you might have for others to consider that.
Absolutely. No, thanks for sharing all that. And
Yeah.
I would say the principle that we operate from, which we learned from Dr. Bob Schutz, is that
Hmm.
healing happens in relationship. Healing
Yeah.
happens in relationship. It can't happen in isolation, actually.
Hmm.
In my opinion, it's impossible. There might be some small things you can do, but it can't be sustained and it can't be truly transformative, in my opinion. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, in terms of therapy, the the benefits are enormous if you have a good, competent therapist.
Hmm.
Some people say that maybe not everyone needs to go to therapy, but everyone could probably benefit from it. But I think if you've been through any sort of trauma in your life, especially if your family was really dysfunctional, your parents separated or divorced, that's traumatic. And so I would say you can really benefit from therapy. Now, in my life, I've done, I think, like 7 years of counseling. I'm not
Mhm.
afraid to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, have benefited greatly. Some therapists more than others.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's been so helpful to, again, have someone to guide you through um, all the emotions, especially and the past like memories and your tendencies toward maybe certain habits or unhealthy ways of behavior, to, to walk through all that with you. Because the role of a therapist, what we've seen is really to kind of help you interpret a lot of like that and to get to the root of like, okay, what happened here. So what, for example, one therapist that we partner with, Margaret, she's a trauma therapist. She's been doing it for like 18 years now. Her therapy model is unique, and what she does in her trauma therapy essentially is helps you to revisit the traumas, so that you can put an end to them. So you
Yeah.
can process them and close that chapter in your life for good. Because what
Mhm.
happens on the level of our brain is the emotional part of our brain, when we go through a trauma, we be the logical side of our brain just shuts off because we become instinctive. We need to like get to safety, right?
Mhm.
And this is true if you were like attacked by someone, if you got shot, you went to war, or if you weren't really neglected at home, or again, like we're saying, your family broke apart. And so your brain, though, that part of your brain has no sense of time. So
Okay.
truly, you can be, 20 years later, 10 years later, your parents maybe got divorced when, you were 11. If you're like me, you're, 21-year-old kid, you can be struggling with similar things, or with certain temptations, or, maybe an addiction to alcohol or lust or something like that, as a reaction to that trauma. But that trauma happened 10 years ago, but you're acting as if it's happening right now.
Yeah.
And so if you can heal that yourself, that would be great. I
Mhm.
haven't found a way to do that. And
Yeah.
so we need God's grace, of course, but I think God gave us these methods on a human level, such as
Mhm.
effective trauma therapy with a competent therapist
Yeah.
that can help us again take that trauma and then bring it to a close, and so that we no longer struggle with those things. And there might be some, remnants of struggles, things here or there, but you truly can see crazy transformations. Like I know in just the stories from my apostolate, we sent a young person to a young person like her 20s to Margaret, to that trauma therapist, and she had an awesome transformation. Was really in a rough spot, struggling with depression, loneliness, anxiety, cutting, even like wanting to just end her life.
Yeah.
And by going through it, she just experienced this awesome transformation, because what that therapy model did was it went to the root of all the symptoms and it helped heal that. And once that's healed, what Margaret often says, and other therapists said this too, the symptoms kind of take care of themselves.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I'm a big fan of it, and I know there's other cutting edge, therapy models out there as well. And so, yeah, I think it's really key to find a good therapist, and that could be really challenging. So we're working on something, trying to build a network of therapists that we vet, that we trust, that we recommend. But that's a work in progress at this point. And we're really excited once that does roll out. And we have like a wait list right now on our website for that,
Wow.
because that, again, is a big problem to find a good one. Because a
Right.
bad one can actually do more harm than good, in my
Sure.
opinion, just to be real with everyone.
Yeah.
But if you find a good one and you vet them properly, then you can end up seeing huge, huge benefits, which I have too.
Yeah.
So happy to go into that more if you'd like.
Yeah. Um, so you you talk about Margaret, her trauma therapy,
Yeah.
um, and we know Bob Schutz. We know that he's got his own John Paul II healing center,
Yeah.
where he's been a Catholic therapist for a very long time, um, and he incorporates the inner healing prayer model, I guess you could call it.
Sure.
Are you familiar with the inner healing prayer ministry, that type of counseling, or I guess prayer ministry, that prayer ministers who understand that stuff? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, roughly like
Mhm.
deliverance prayer and things like that. I know a little
Yeah.
bit about Neil Lozano and people like that, but I
Yeah.
don't know. To be honest, I don't know a ton about it. But I will just say two things quickly. One, love Dr. Bob and the JP2 Healing Center, and that's exactly some of the experts that we point people towards.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say is, just want to mention, if this is helpful to your listeners, is that we have a free course on our website by
Great.
the trauma therapist Margaret. It's
Yeah.
a course on trauma. It's 2 hours long. They're
Hmm.
like 3 to 5 minute videos,
Hmm.
and you can learn like what is trauma, how does it affect you on multiple different levels, and what can you do to heal from it so you can have more mastery over your emotions. They don't
Hmm.
control you as much. So a lot of great content, and it's geared especially towards people who come from broken, dysfunctional divorced families. So that's on our website. That course is called Broken to Whole, and again, it's free. You can just
Yeah,
take it
that's
whenever you want. So
great.
just wanted to mention those things. But yeah, I'm not as familiar with the inner healing deliverance prayer.
Right. Um, but yeah, thank you for mentioning that resource available for the listeners. Honestly, because I was able to spend some time with that marriage and family therapist way back when.
Yeah.
It was actually on a Dr. Bob Schuchts men's retreat. Dr. Bob Schuchts led this retreat. There was 125 other
Wow.
guys there. So the basics of whether it's inner healing or the marriage and family therapy counseling and that type of thing,
Yeah.
it's basically getting to the core, kind of like what you mentioned, of getting to the core of those emotions where the trauma occurred, the abuse, the neglect, whatever it was, and bringing them to the surface so that we can release them, get rid of them. And so whatever method is used, again, it typically involves other people helping out, other people who are cooperating with God's grace. And so
Mm.
there is the help available for those of you who are really struggling with this type of thing with your parents' divorce and the pain that went along with it. Uh,
Mm.
Anything, Joey, that you want to add to that?
No, that's beautiful. And I think that it's really important as Catholics, I think that, and I know you agree with this, is that, we take this two-pronged approach of the spiritual and the human. Because I've seen people fall into both camps, where they maybe overemphasize the human, where they just rely on the world of psychology, which is a dangerous trap. I think there's a lot of good things there, but you're going to hit a ceiling at some point. Like only God can heal us at the level that we really need it. But again, I think He gave us a lot of these human methods, the good ones, to help us to heal and to become more whole.
Yeah.
And then on the spiritual side, the temptation I think is just to kind of pray things away, to maybe just focus. Again, I'm a huge fan of the sacraments and prayer, but I think that God, we kind of maybe take that approach often of just like going to confession or praying the rosary, going to mass, and thinking like that alone will take care of it. Again, super necessary to do, and that's one component of healing, but we need to take the spiritual and the human and put them together. And that's what I like seeing with Dr. Bob's work, and I'm sure your work is like that as well. We need both. We're not just one or the other.
I guess we'll be getting close to wrapping up here, Joey. But are there other points that you'd like to make, or anything that we may have missed on here that you wanna help our listeners understand better, or just to know about?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to anyone who comes from a divorced family, like your
Yeah,
parents are divorced, or maybe they're separated, or things are just really dysfunctional. And then also speak a little bit to parents who maybe have gone through a divorce, and maybe they're listening to this and they're kind of, their heart's heavy, thinking like, man, I didn't want to hurt my kids. And I
yeah,
hate the fact that, that was the case. So to any young people or not young people who come from divorced, broken families, I just want to say that you're not doomed to repeat the cycle of dysfunction that you experienced growing up. Like you can build a better life. You can build, beautiful relationships. You can learn, you can grow, you can become, a saint essentially. That's totally possible with God's grace. And so, relying on God's grace, relying on people around you like mentors, the three things that have been really helpful for me kind of at a high level is just consuming really good content,
yeah,
just content when it comes to like understanding trauma, healing, growth in your spiritual life, like reading lives of the saints. Like that content is just can be life changing if you're tapped into the right resources, like this podcast, Dr.
yeah.
Bob's podcast, and so on. The second thing I would say is, like we said, coaching or mentorship is just so helpful, whether that's with a therapist, whether that's with a spiritual director. Those are different, obviously, but they can both be really, really helpful and played a huge role in my healing. And then also even just mentors in your life. I probably the people who've helped me the most in my life are just people who are just more like mentors generally for me in life. And so I think that's one thing I would recommend too. And then finally, we need people to walk beside too, like friends and community who've been through similar things that we've been through. And so those three components are kind of the tools that we like to recommend to people when it comes to kind of working through the trauma, the challenges that you've been through, and really just finding the healing so you can feel more whole. And then ultimately, again, break that cycle of dysfunction and divorce in your own life. And so I'm so sorry for what you've been through. I
Mm.
want you to know it's not your fault. For, as corny as that might sound, it's important that we talk about this because I remember one dad reached out to me. He said, Joey, my wife and I, we're getting divorced. And then the day where I was going to leave home, I didn't want to, but my wife wanted the divorce. I was in the bathroom just crying.
Wow.
And my own son, he found me and he, came into the bathroom. He looked at me and he said, Dad, is this my fault?
Mm.
And thankfully in that moment, like the father just like wrapped him in his arms and just reassured him like, no, 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 this is not your fault.
Yeah.
And so I think we all need to hear that at some level because especially if we were really young when the separation of the divorce happened, it can be really easy to blame ourselves or to think maybe we could have done something to prevent it. And so I'm here to say like, it wasn't your fault. There's nothing you could have prevented. There's nothing you did to cause it. And sadly, there's nothing you can do to fix it. There's maybe ways you can influence your parents or help them. But it's not your job to be like the marriage fixer, the therapist.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I hope that it is hopeful and helpful and that you just believe even that you can heal, you can grow. It is worth the effort. It's not easy work. But it's something that you can see results from if you put in the time, if you put in the effort, if you first believe that it's even possible, but then commit yourself to it. So that's what I would say to anyone listening who comes from a divorced or broken family. There's
Yeah.
so much hope. And
Wow.
then to parents listening right now too, just quickly, I would say, um, you play a huge role in helping your children, a
Mm.
huge role. You might feel like your role as a parent has been abdicated or taken from you, depending on what happened in your situation. I'm here to tell you, like, that's a lie. Like your children need you. And there's a study they did in Turkey on high school students who came from divorced families. And as you'd expect, they found that these, children of divorce were more likely to struggle with anxiety, depression, and loneliness. But for those young people who had a good relationship with one or both parents, they were significantly less likely to experience the anxiety, depression, and loneliness. Like there was a noticeable statistical difference. And so I think that's super hopeful for parents. Like you play a huge role, parents. And I know it can be exhausting depending on what you've been through to like invest in your kids, but rely on God's grace. Avoid the trap of, relying on your kids for your emotional support. And I would say, any bad words you might, bad mouthing you might feel towards your spouse, like don't bring that to your kids. That's not their role. And, don't put them in the middle too, is one of the other traps we often see parents fall into. Like that's just all of that can be really damaging to the children. But again, nothing we were saying in this conversation is meant to condemn or to tear you down, but really just help you to build you up. And more importantly, to help your children to just live these healthy, holy, happy lives. Because we want the same thing, right? We want your children to live those happy, holy lives. But where we need to start, and this is where often people don't want to go, is with the uncomfortable truths. It's like if a doctor is going to, do a surgery and, take out cancer, for example, he's going to have to make those incisions. It's going to be painful. It's not going to be easy. But in the same way we do in the physical healing world, in this emotional realm, we need to just acknowledge the trauma that's happened, the emotional wounds, and be able to heal them and then move beyond them. That's the whole point. Like we're not meant to stay here forever. And so that's what I would say. And just know of my prayers as well for all of you. Count on them.
Yeah, that was just beautifully said. Uh, what a message of hope, Joey, that you're giving people. That and
Thank you.
whether it be if you are from a broken family, from a family of divorce, or if you've been through a divorce yourself, or if the thought of divorce is going through your minds, there is hope. And
Yeah.
I encourage anyone that might be considering divorce, just hang in there. Um, Things will get better. It's not, like I said, it's a roller coaster ride, and you will thank God in the long run because you stuck it out. So I just encourage all it's a prayer I have almost every night, is strengthening of the family, strengthening of marriages. So just hang in there. It's going to be okay. Jesus is there with you. He wants healing. That was one of his main ministries here on earth, was preaching, but healing was huge too. And that's what he wants for all of us. Would you agree, Joey?
Couldn't agree more. And two resources, if it's okay, I wanted to mention for
Yes,
any
please.
struggling marriages right now.
Mhm.
One is the Alexander House. Greg and Julie Alexander, they were on their last thread in their marriage. They're both
Mhm.
cheating on each other, like almost as worse as you can get. It all blew up in their face and they were just done. They're like, we want to get divorced. And so they actually went to their priest to kind of start that process and figure out what would a divorce look like and maybe an annulment. And he wisely challenged them. He said, okay, like I get that this is a disaster. This is a really painful, difficult situation. But when God invented this thing called marriage, what did he have in mind? Like what's its purpose? And he challenged them to just like research that, figure that out.
Mhm.
And through that, they were able to heal their marriage and to rescue their family, which is really beautiful. They saved their kids a lot of heartache, even though they went through a lot, obviously, and what happened. But now they run this organization helping struggling marriages. And so the Alexander House, you can just Google that. Their book is Marriage 911. And they've helped in the past 20 years, they've helped over 5,000 couples. And their
Wow.
success rate at keeping the marriage together and healing the family is 98%, if you can
Oh,
believe
that's
that.
amazing.
Yeah, they're great. And so couldn't recommend them more. And then for anyone who maybe isn't ready to jump into that, Layla Miller, a Catholic author, she wrote a book called Impossible Marriages Redeemed. The bishop at the time in Phoenix, Bishop Olmsted, he asked Layla, he said, hey, we need a book of just stories of beautiful testimonies of marriages that were like in a horrible situation, horrible condition that were then, rescued and
Wow.
redeemed. And so she put together like 50 stories of marriages that were just again like even abuse and infidelity and
Yeah.
pregnancies out of wedlock, like all this crazy stuff that you would think, oh my gosh, there's no hope for these marriages.
Mhm.
In the end, it took time. It was not easy. A lot of God's grace, a lot of working through things on a human level too. But in time, like they were able to build these really beautiful marriages. And
Mhm.
so both those resources. So again, Marriage 911 and the Alexander House is the first one. And then Impossible Marriages Redeemed. The subtitle is They Didn't End the Story in the Middle.
Yeah.
And so
Wow.
that's another book by Layla Miller that I would recommend.
Awesome. Thank you for those resources too, Joy. I'd like to just add one more if I could.
Please.
It's called Retrovive. Maybe you've heard of that
Yeah.
organization before. So my mom and dad in their struggles in life later on, when they started to realize that, hey, we can make it through this, they
Mm,
actually they went to Retrovive at my prodding and at my urging. They
beautiful.
finally went, and it turned their life around when they realized that it's a lot about letting the other person know how you feel, what are your emotions that you're going through, and expressing these emotions to each other so that we
Mm,
understand each other, so that husband and wife understand what they are going through. And
mm,
so Retrovive taught that method of communication, and they became Retrovive leaders for several years themselves. So talk about
wow.
hope, that there is hope for the future. So what a beautiful thing
Mm,
that my mom and dad were able to turn their lives around and then affect other lives through what
mm.
they had gone through, and bring hope and peace and joy to the people that they met. So what a blessing that was.
Wow.
So Joey, I think
Beautiful.
we'll wrap things up here, but let me give you the last word before we end here. So anything else you'd want to add here?
Something Dr. Bob Sheets said, something I read from him once was that I forget if this was Aquinas or another expert who said that, at the root of every wound is a deprivation or a distortion of love.
Yeah.
And so naturally, if we want to heal, if we want, a better life, if we want to be more virtuous, if we want better relationships, a better marriage, we truly need to heal. And the place that we need to go is to authentic love, first in our relationship with God,
Yeah.
and then also in our relationship with other people. That experience of love is healing.
Hmm.
And so that's what I would encourage everyone to do is deepen your interior lives, flood your soul with God's grace, and then seek out those good relationships. So often, especially here in America, like we're so isolated.
Yeah.
But we really need to build like a structure, a community, almost like a system around us
Hmm.
to help us to love, to build those beautiful relationships that we're not just on the receiving end of the love, but we're on the giving end too, which is healing in itself as well.
Yeah.
So I would just encourage people who maybe feel depleted, they feel stuck, that there's hope. Healing is possible. It's beautiful. Look around you, find the people in your life who maybe were in a really rough, stuck spot, and then they were able to heal and to grow, and now they're thriving. They're doing better. There's tons of examples around you, and if you can't find them locally, find them online too. That they're out there, and that will give you hope that it's possible and kind of fuel your journey as well. So just know that I'm praying for you. And if my ministry, my apostolate can help you at all, we're here to help you. Whether you're, a young person, a teenager, young adult who comes from a divorced or broken family, or maybe you're outside of that age range. A lot of people have said they found our stuff helpful. Or maybe you're someone who just wants to help someone, a parent, a boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, relative who wants to help someone who comes from a broken family. We have resources for you as well. You can find all of that on our website at restoredministry.com.
Awesome. Joey, thank you so much for that. You know what? Talk about authentic love. I just met you about an hour ago. I have such a deep brotherly love for you after what we just spoke about. Joey, you are just doing
Thanks,
some
man.
amazing things. I am so grateful to be blessed by having met you today. And I hope we can talk more in the future. You're just doing some wonderful things, and I'm so grateful for what you do. So thank you so much, Joey, for doing this. Again,
You're
this is
welcome.
Joey.
Right back
Yes,
at you.
you bet. Joey Pontarelli with restoredministry.com. Get that book. It's Not Your Fault. And then check out that website. Get those resources. Spread the word. This guy's going places, and he's going to help you get what you need and change your life for the better. So thank you again, Joey. God bless you, and thank you for what you do. May the Lord be with you always, buddy.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate you having me on.
All right.